So Judge, I'm going to give a little introduction here. So we have Kurt Doolittle, and he's going to show us how to, the method, which is mechanism for
producing decidability.
Yes, for hashing it out and making what was reasonable to calculable using language.
All right, so this is part one of the method. The part before this is the introduction. We've somewhat covered that. So I love these. And you've been, again, I want to tell the audience that you've been incredibly helpful, because I go over this with you. Then I take the presentation to the team and I go over with them. And then, of course, I realize I have to rewrite it so that it's digestible. But this is extremely valuable for me because it's really a market test, right? It's your alpha test. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it together.
It's a great pleasure.
So this is the method. We're going to create a universally commensurable, value-neutral system of measurement out of ordinary language. It's important because, let's say if we took chemistry, there's a subset of language there. It's dealing with a single domain. If we take math, it covers a lot of certain domains, and it's, believe it or not, math fails at many ends of the spectrum, both the top and the bottom, for reasons we might cover here. What we're trying to do is produce the most complete system of measurement across all human domains of thought. I say it's really not that complicated. In essence, it's really not. It's one principle, right? But it's like many things, the universe has a set of fundamental forces that are very simple, but those fundamental forces produce all of life and everything we think about and everything. So in other words, the first cause of the method is incredibly simple, but what happens out of applying that first cause is amazing. Just like in math, the minute you say it's just positional names and you come out with names of positions in a thing called counting, all of a sudden all of mathematics comes out of the fact that you've just given names to some position, and that's the only dimension available. So I think unfortunately we've covered some of this. So what problem are we trying to solve with the method? We're trying to create an unambiguous system of measurement that eliminates ambiguity, so we can reduce or eliminate the possibility of ignorance, error, bias, and deceit. So the real reason I came up with this method, right, was when I started out to create be able to Western people to be able to explain their group strategy in rational and scientific terms. That's all I was after. But once I figured out that the problem is, well, how do we know what's true? Because Western people practice truth before face at all costs. How do I define truth? How do I determine what's true? So my sort of project fell out of that initial question. And I had worked on the Constitution, and I'm working on the Constitution. I said, well, how do I handle the problem of lying? I mean, that's the fundamental problem. It's, we lived in a world where stealing was the biggest problem. And so we built laws and institutions to prevent stealing. We did a pretty piss poor job of preventing fraud, and we've done no job at all against undermining an insurrection. So how do I create a constitution that has a system of laws where the test of whether you're lying, cheating, deceiving is testable in court? Now, court is just a purely empirical place. I mean, the most of what they're trying to do in court is figure out what really happened and figure out who's lying, because whoever's lying probably is guilty. I mean, that's really what happens in court.
Interesting problem.
It's just the evolution of the problem isn't like I set out. Most academics go out into the world and they try to go from books to problems, which is what can I solve from within the academy and get famous. Right. And the opposite of which many philosophers will tell you is do the opposite. Go out, have some life, and then go from problems to books and try to solve a real problem.
Right, I appreciate that. And it's like the method is, interesting to me, the method is the tool that you required in order to accomplish the objective you originally set out to do.
Correct.
So I think it's quite interesting. So you invent the tools by necessity.
And of doing that. What I found, of course, is being on the low end of the autistic spectrum, is that I could finally talk about in rational terms what I was thinking.
I like
Because and I find that that's why a lot of guys are attracted to this method, is because it provides people the ability to explain what they're thinking. I was at a group yesterday and, went off on a couple of fun rants, and explaining causal relations. And I said, my job is really to give you words. Right. All right. Aside from the job the job of the method is to give you words, right? That's the average person's need. But once we have those words, we can understand what the way to organize society truthfully, instead of by industrializing verbal warfare with each other at industrial scales using every form of media. These are vocabulary terms. In other words, this talk as presentation is part of our courseware, right? I'm producing courseware that we teach. So this is just some vocabulary I'm telling you in the beginning you'll want to know, right? By the end. So it's sort of like tell the checklist. You don't have to know this. It's just, right, we're going to cover those topics. So the method consists of a couple of parts. The first part is an introduction. Then we're going to take language and break it into parts: vocabulary, statements and sentences, then sentences into stories, and then how stories work within paradigms. So the method is the same simple process applied from words all the way to arguments. But to make arguments that aren't false, you need to know what the first principles are of basically the sciences. When we say a science, it's basically a fundamental law that everything is derived from. So we would go through the first principles of the formal, the logical, the physical, the behavioral, and the evolutionary sciences. And some of these things are very trivial. Going through DNA isn't that difficult, right? And some of these things are very complicated, like behavioral, because behavior is what we're primarily trying to discuss. The third part is what you were asking about, which is truth and false, truth and deceit. Truth and deceit is actually reciprocity and irreciprocity, which is the global version of it, and truth and deceit as the verbal version.
Right.
So we go over those two, and that ends up with law, right? And from law, we can go through government and government and constitution, whatever. So the method really goes through first principles. Today, if we're lucky, we'll get through part one. Part two would take a lot of sessions. It's long because we have to discover the first principle of pretty much every discipline. And what will be horrifying is once you see the method, is that all existence from physics to our most complex is based on one algorithm. I found it disturbing, like many things I found disturbing in my work. I didn't, I think that truth is an interesting way to look, is if you're trying to solve a general problem in some area, you can make a lot of justifications. But when you're looking for truth independent of context, you don't get to make prevarications, excuses, or finish early, right? There's only one done.
That's it. Done
is done, and there's no other done. People ask me, well, you've been working on this for what, 15 years? I've said, well, the average, what is it? A good PhD will take you 6 or 7. Mastery of a field will take you 10 to 15. And I'm trying to solve truth. It's not like I'm trying to solve, what is this? What hydrocarbons is this combined with?
Interesting problem is like solve for truth and show your work. It's a hell of a
until there's nothing left.
It's a short command, but it's a long job.
So it's funny, and I tell people to solve for what defined truth, how it would be. That wasn't that hard. It took me about a year of hard work. I mean, I worked hard. I mean, it was hard work. Religion was really hard. It was the hardest problem at all. So, I mean, certain problems are extraordinarily difficult. I understood truth and the grammars, early by 2014, but all the rest of it is just a lot of work. Anyway, so that's the outline. That's essentially the table of contents. And unfortunately, right. confused myself, but I forgot my continue me here line. All right. I put this up here because it contains the method, right? The problem is that I wanted to show you I could tell you the method narratively. What I wanted to do is say, this is what applying the method looks like. It looks like an algorithm, or it looks like an algorithm or algorithmically structured argument, a sequence. Now, if you go back to Wittgenstein, right, and his stuff, I mean, he exasperates the hell out of me because I think it's such nonsense, but he was actually trying to get to this. So if you read his Tractatus, he actually uses a similar form. Of course, it's all over the place. And if you go back to Spinoza, you can see Spinoza trying the same thing. Spinoza is interesting because of his parsimony. I mean, it's incredibly dense for that reason. It's not like Kant or, God forbid, one of the postmodernists where it's word salad, right? I mean, it's very structured argument. So you can see over history people trying to do this, right? They're trying to get here. Everybody who tries to solve the hard problem eventually ends up with some variation on getting to this result.
All right.
So I'm going to walk through it. Continuous recursive disambiguation. The universe does that. Atoms do that. Molecules do that. Chemistry does that. Life does that. Continuous recursive disambiguation is the process that's occurring. What is occurring, of course, is a trial and error attempt to discover opportunities to defeat entropy. So it's continuous recursive disambiguation. The process requires enumeration, like listing all the parts, organizing them in some sort of order so that they form a system of measurement, and then describing them in terms of human actions.
That's operationalization.
Right. A logical test in your mind is an action. There's no difference between you thinking about moving your arm reaching up to a ball and not doing it and thinking.
Right.
It's the same exact process. You just don't release emotion. So all thinking is derived from motion. For that reason, we can describe all human subjectively testable processes as operations. And an operation is an actionable sequence of cause and effect before, during, and after in time. So what we mean is we're producing a system of measurement in time. And we're trying to do that to disambiguate whatever it is, whether word, set, phrase, sentence, narrative, or narrative within paradigm, into its first causes. So we're trying to, this is what Elon Musk or other people call first cause thinking. First cause thinking is just what happens when you apply science until you discover the first causes. Once you know the first causes, you're just practicing logic. Does that make sense? The purpose of science is to discover the underlying language or logic of any system. And we're going to do this at every scale of stable relations, terms, statements, sentences, stories, etc. Now, in math, they call this a symmetry. We call it first causes. But if we look at the universe, the universe has its Big Bang or whatever close happened to that. And a small part of it ended up as hydrogen and helium. A small part of that ended up as suns. A small part of that, their explosions ended up as basic elements, the metals. And a small part of that ended up as planets. A small part of that ended up in planets in a habitable zone. A small part of that ended up being in the right conditions on a planet in a habitable zone with water, et cetera, until you get life. So it's smaller and smaller. So each of those things we call elements, molecules, biomolecules, life to cellular life to organic life to multicellular, all the way up till we're thinking of whatever where it is, the most advanced thing we humans can do. That's a set of stable relations, and what a paradigm is a set of stable relations. Now, this is because the universe develops states of what are called symmetries. And a symmetry is a thing that can maintain state for some period of time. Now, in physics or whatever. So realistically, an element of hydrogen stays in a stable relation because its forces are undergoing a consistently symmetric process where no matter what happens, it returns to the same state. right? So that's what a stable state means. And so once that happens, now we have a vocabulary, a set of words to build the molecules with. And once we have that, we have a stable set of vocabulary and logic to build biochemistry with. Once we have biochemistry, of a set of vocabulary to use to build at such and such. And so this process is continuous, of the continuous process developing stable relations.
Right.
Human experience is what we call existence. Nouns refer to stable relations. So we're trying to discover first principles, which are the first causes of stable relations that produce all subsequent effects within a paradigm or a domain or a discipline. So we're trying to basically find out what the fundamental forces are at every scale of human behavior. It's creepy how simple they are. So we would produce these first causes by stable relations, and then we reconstruct all of those domains from first principles, first causes of those stable relations.
Right.
So, like I said, the purpose of science is discover first causes. First causes are stable relations at whatever level of abstraction we're working with. Pre-fundamental forces, which we don't know, fundamental forces, which we think we know, atoms, which we're certain we know, molecules, which we know a good range of, but the applications seem endless. We know that logic. It's like we're beginning to understand the logic of proteins, it's so horrifyingly complex. It's spiritual, it's so complex. So that's what we mean by reconstruction, is now we've got to go back and do to other fields exactly what we've done with chemistry, is describe it all in a set of constructions from first principles. Human behavior is going to be constructed from basic incentives that produce relatively stable reaction. In other words, you and I would react the same. That's a stable relation. I always figured when I talked about this, no one would understand what I'm saying, and you are, and it's throwing me off. So,
it took me a while though. I'm studying this, and I just think about it, and I'm like, wow, trying to make it like this premise of the stable relations, the symmetries, and that it's homeostasis essentially. Is like, but
equilibrium, homeostasis, yes.
Yeah, and
homeostasis requires some system to maintain it, and stable relations don't. In other words, so what you've just identified is you've just identified something great, is that our homeostasis, which is our basic foundation, is predicated on systems that are self-regulating because of natural forces.
Right.
Then proteins that aren't self-regulating because of natural forces, they need information to do so.
Right.
To homeostasis in the body, which needs all sorts of complex stuff to maintain still stable relations. To behavior that's emergent from the necessity to maintain homeostasis, right, despite varying conditions. But the disturbing thing is how clear that process is from the initial Big Bang to you and I talking trash about, some nonsense in the bar at 2 a.m. because we've had an extra whatever, right?
Right.
The fact that that's all deterministic, in other words, deterministic in the sense that based on a very a simple set of hierarchical constant relations that are all subsets of the previous grammar that allowed that. Well, I mean, that's kind of beautiful, wondrous, amazing, spiritual, but knowing that it's that simple is creepy. I don't know why, but it disturbs me. A lot of science has been a process of making us uncomfortable with nature, right? Because what we really want is we want to be children of parents, or parents of elders, and elders of headmen. That's what we want, because there's a chain of responsibility to throw something up to who's smarter than you are. But when you realize it's the accidental calculation of stable relations in a hierarchy of degrees of complexity, it's dehumanizing, like not being the center of the universe, or the solar system, or the universe, or that evolution was random. It's just disturbing.
What wonderful work.
Anyway, So then we reconstruct these, but we do so, we reconstruct all domains in the operational terms. So when I say P-law is a big program, or the P program is big, it's because I have to pretty much touch everything.
Mm-hmm.
I have to touch everything at least at its foundations.
Right.
So you don't have to fix math, right? I mean, it isn't because math needs to change. It needs to be, if we want to have a dispute about math or math's effect on physics, we can do so in scientific terms.
Right.
So take those operational terms, and these relations are disambiguated by permissible dimensions. In other words, every first principle causes a set of consequences that are continuous. So that is a dimension. So just like we have the color spectrum, that's a dimension, right? It's a continuous, it's the same thing at a different scale from visible light to invisible light at both ends.
Right.
So we're looking to take those first principles and produce dimensions. Those dimensions tell us what those dimensions are there, what possible operations tell us what can be transformed. So dimensions meaning nouns, possible transformations meaning verbs, and what logic and vocabulary that exists at each stage.
Right.
And if we do that, we get a single, consistent, coherent, correspondent hierarchy of paradigms. I call them grammars instead of logics on purpose, across all human language, human knowledge. And this gives us our universally commensurable value-neutral language across all human domains, which allows us to testify about those domains. In other words, we can testify in court as to what the possibility of those, or the possibility and probability of such things. And we create universal decidability within and across domains. In other words, we can tell what's false. We don't, because it's not based on first principles. This differs from ideal truth in the sense of, well, there's still things we don't know. But what we don't know will still be dependent upon first principles,
Right.
limited by. What the result of this, all of this is what's called a constructive logic, not a deductive logic, but a constructive logic. In other words, in mathematics, we use primitives, basically triangles, to measure all sorts of things, right? That's our system of measurement. That allows us to produce a deductive logic, or when you create a proof, you're trying to say, I can prove the deduction of something. A constructive logic works the other way. I can build something out of these Lego bricks.
Yes.
So we're producing a constructive logic. What threw mankind off for 2,000 years or longer was the fact that the difference between constructive and deductive logic in math, which was the gold standard of reasoning, turns out to be marginally indifferent in most cases. Whereas everything other than math, it's not marginally indifferent.
It's quite interesting because it goes to the Newtonian physics and into relativity.
Correct.
It's not exactly right, but it's right enough for most cases up until this point. And then it becomes divergent enough that it's okay. Now we need to develop our parse it out a little bit differently, I suppose.
Yep.
Very good.
And it became important. When did it become important? Well, the steam engine became important when British had to pump water out of coal mines so they could heat houses, right? I mean, but or forge metal. And the Roman Empire just never had that problem of needing to heat houses, right? So, you think about those really annoying things in history that really cause vast differences in time. Well, the same thing happened with Newton. I mean, his ballistics tables were necessary. The ballistic table isn't necessary for throwing an arrow or a rock. I mean, it's humanly perceivable, but a ballistics table is necessary because it's not humanly perceivable, right? And
we need a stronger system of measurement to have to cope with the superhuman functions that are
right. And so basically, what happened is that we keep increasing scale. And there's a pattern that's really beautiful, and that is, does morality scale from the interpersonal and familial to the social, to the political, to the national, to the world? No. Now, the rule is the same, but what's moral changes at every different scale. The same is true for economics. Is the economics of your household, which is communist, the economics of your society, which is socialist, the economics of your nation, which has to be, frankly, like if I say fascist, everybody will think it means Nazi. It just means it has to contain, right? The export of the export of sharing has to be contained to the polity as commons. So economics doesn't scale, or the economics of the household doesn't scale to the business, to the industry, to the economy, to the nation, to the world, because these things eventually become competitors instead of cooperators. Well, the same thing happened in our knowledge, is that our knowledge hit human scale in the 1800s, and we started working beyond human scale in every field. And it turns out that at that point, you need not justificationary logic, you need falsificationary logic or adversarial logic. And so what went wrong, of course, is that, like I said, Babbage invented the computer mechanically, but he didn't turn it into a general theory, and nobody picked up on it, probably because the Industrial Revolution was growing so fast that, you know, it creates the error of wealth. And so we lost over 100 years, and we're still paying the cost of it, because we made open the introduction by not solving the problem of constructive logic, which we ended up doing it in the 1920s, which was too late. And so we did it in the 20s, and it was too late, and so it failed. And we got Einstein and Bohr's failure to actually solve the problem. We said, yeah, well, they solved the problem. No, they didn't. They solved the description. They didn't solve the first principle, which is cause. And so now we're stuck in physics because of that. Well, I mean, this reversal of justificationary and moral to falsificationary and legal, and falsificationary and scientific, this inversion should have happened in the 17 or 1800s, and it didn't. And my view is that's because of too much happened in the Industrial Revolution. It made too much happen too fast. And so,
Definitely.
you know, some historians say the Industrial Revolution was 300 years early. I don't know. I just know that it produced so much change so fast that I'll open the door to idiocy, in which we're stuck with. Anyway, I'm trying to get through this. But that's what a constructive logic is. A constructive logic doesn't say you have to prove what's true. It says you eliminate what's ignorant, what requires ignorance, error, bias, wishful thinking, loading, framing, suggestion, obscurantism, sophistry, pseudoscience, supernaturalism, occultism. You know, it gets rid of all that stuff, because you can't testify to any of those things. So we produce a constructive logic of first principles that's testifiable. We don't have to know what's true. We just have to know you're lying. Does that make sense? Because anything that's not lying is true enough.
If I can't prove you're lying, we presume it to be true.
We presume it true enough.
There you go.
True enough. So the other thing we do is we use supply demand curves. Is it enough? True enough.
I got you.
Right? So we use supply demand curves instead of sets.
Got you.
So that's why I say it's very hard to reduce what we're talking about to the familiar set. This or that. You can't really reduce it to that, because it's all supply demand. So we have to ask people to think a little more, with a little more discipline, just like when we taught them basic sciences, they had to think with a little more discipline. Now we have to ask them to think with a little more discipline. That's the problem I run into, is everybody wants me to simplify it down to the previous generations, like simplifying science back to theology. You can't. So the result of that falsification is speech, and story, and argument by strict constructions that produce a contract for meaning. In other words, you can say what I'm promising you is contractual. It's testimony. I've performed due diligence on it. I'm warranting it, and I will remain liable for it. In other words, it's sufficient for court. If it's sufficient for court, there is no domain it's insufficient for.
I like that.
Go into the rest. This is important. You get the basic idea. If you understand that, that's the overview of the method.
Beautiful.
Now, how do we actually apply it?
Yeah.
So we define dimensions and their constant relations, terms and types, statements and sentences, stories, grammars. Instead of saying sublanguage or discipline or logic, I've chosen grammar. And that's because what is a grammar? but it's the logic of continuous recursive disambiguation within a paradigm. Right? So I'm saying that we use these words incorrectly. Well, I'll cover this more in a minute. So if you just think about it as I talk about the logic of physics and chemistry and biology and psychology and social science or whatever, as I call the logic of those disciplines grammars, because I have to deal with the vocabulary, the logic, the limits, the first causes. And then we go into the first causes, then the behavioral sciences, the applied sciences. And so that's the method applied. We apply it to everything from the very basic of perception right up onto the law. We even go to art. So some examples are define moral. That's a term. I see a black cat as a statement. All swans are white is an argument. It's like finding a needle in a haystack is an analogy. You can use analogies, similes, metaphors, whatever. The tendency of rock is to fall down, which is a wisdom literature. Those have all been positive, right? Those are all positives. Yeah. We can also do it to define deceptions. Everything written in this box is false. Well, it's a deceit by means of sophistry. We can inflate our way out of debt. That's a fraud by pseudoscience. Man was oppressed. That's undermining by critique or sedition. And he was healed, or something like that. I probably should take that one out there so I don't piss off Christians.
I think that
21 virgins is what I'll use.
Oh my.
Figure out who I'm going to offend. Well, I have to find something. So that's an example of the positive and negative spectrum, all the way from terms to wisdom, and all the way from sophistry to supernaturalism. So we can get in all these, we can disambiguate, categorize, and test the testifiability of anything across all the human spectrum, whether it's an attempt to be true or an attempt to be false. If it's an attempt to be true, then you're only engaged, you're only engaged in error or ignorance or bias, right? But you could also be engaged in what's false, fraud, theft, and deceit.
So we would characterize this as we can decide intent.
We what?
We decipher intention.
Correct. So like philosophy is sanitized by Victorian gentlemen who would never resort to insult of one another. The law doesn't follow that limit, right? It's unlimited. So the law is, that's why again people don't like me, is because I use the prosecutorial method of the law, which says you're just attempting to lie, cheat, and steal, instead of the non-prosecutorial method of philosophy, which just says whether that's true or false.
We would say you're mistaken instead of clarifying the exact nature of the error.
Yes. So it's just a more refined version. This is a more expansive method. We get out of it a formal operational grammar that gives us the vocabulary of testifiability, what we call tort. In other words, it's not just choice. It's like we just said, we're not determining just whether you're right or wrong. We're determining whether you're right or wrong, and it's in furtherance of a good or a crime. There's more risk if you enter into a P-logic debate, because really the outcome very often, more often than not, isn't that you're mistaken. It's almost universally that you're trying to engage in lying, cheating, and stealing, and you're just justifying it. That's the issue here, is that philosophy is gentlemanly, which allows all the bad things to happen. Our law has left free speech rather than truthful speech. It has allowed free speech that's seditious rather than producing goods and ends. So the problem is the same, is that the same problem in philosophy is problem in our law. It's optimistic. Now, the reason it's optimistic is because we had the duel. Right, because if it failed, we went out. We were outlaws. We went outside the law, and they're no longer insured by the community. So if we wanted to kill each other, fine, because we'd chosen not to have the community protect us. That's what outlaw means. You're outside the law. What does the law mean? You're outside the insurance of the community.
Okay.
And so we had the duel. So if you and I played some game here, if you weren't honest, I wasn't honest with you, you could kill me. Well, that's a really good system, it turns out. But when we don't want to kill each other anymore because the externalities of killing people turns out to be pretty high for their families and as a consequence for society. We prefer to just put everything into court, anything more than a fist fight over honor into court. And unfortunately, our law didn't compensate for the loss of the duel and in exchange for free speech.
That's
and it had no way of visioning.
That's an interesting first cause. I like that, man. It's very, very succinct.
As I say, everything is obvious when constructed from first causes. That's what I mean. The consistency is disturbing. If you just think of things instead of ideals, which is an average, right. We know the problem with averages and statistics. It's how you lie. Well, if instead of talking about ideals, you talk about series, spectrums, and distributions, series or a distribution, then all of a sudden the lies become quite a bit harder. So
very good.
So as a consequence, we produce what I've said, and I think I've covered all this. I think I covered this in the previous slide. Oh yeah, I meant to do here's what it does and here's what it produces, and I did it all in one slide. The end result is you get this thing that looks a lot like contract law, except it's written more strictly like a programming language.
Okay.
All right. So the point I want to be is law got very close, but without first principles, it devolved from an empirical science into philosophy. Because tort law is just science.
Okay.
But the minute you add positive law, in other words, whatever excuse democratic legislatures can make up to issue a command, all of a sudden you've avoided the scientific and logical foundations of the law. And of course, then you can't make proofs.
Right.
You can't make proofs of truth, you can't make proofs of falsehood, and you can't make laws that are proofs. In other words, laws that are just. You can make laws that are unjust, laws that mean nothing, and laws that pit people against each other. So this failure is catastrophic. That's what I mean. The position we're in the 20th century is due to us making utopian judgments about the nature of man without understanding 5,000 years of European civilizational evolution from its first principles of self-determination by self-determined means. We started out with the only purely empirical civilization. And in the 20th century, we screwed it up. Well, actually, the Christianity screwed it up in the first century, and we screwed it up again in the 19th, excuse me, by failing. So this is what it sort of looks like, and actually it looks like that's what a program looks like. If you write a program, it looks like this.
Right.
The difference is a program can only refer to things that are actionable by a computer. Right? A computer has to know what its basic types are, what its compound types are, what its basic data types are, what it can be constructed from, what its advanced data types are, what can be constructed from those types, just like what molecules can we construct from primary elements. So a computer has to know those things. And so because it can't choose like we can fudge and a computer can't. Right. So we can resort to judgment, and a computer has to maintain calculation. What we're trying to do is maintain calculation, empiricism, coherence, and consistence with reality in our speech and in our law.
Right.
All right. So what we're doing is producing an algorithmic logic, not a set logic, but an algorithmic logic of supply and demand for the entire spectrum of human behavior.
Okay.
All right. Now, there's a lot of lawyers who tell you, I learned programming in contract law isn't that different. It's not the judge and the court that's the problem. It's the Constitution and the failure of our Constitution to include the fact that, hey, this is science, it's not philosophy.
Okay.
So again, it looks like a programming language, except that you program computers positively because they have no means of judgment. You program people via negativa, negatively. So the Muslim religion tells you what to do. The European religion of law tells you only what not to do. Anything you can't not, you must not do, anything other than what you must not do is good. It's not the government's choice. It's self-determination by individual, family, group, nation. And so what we've produced is a bridge between programming and ordinary language. What we've done is we've limited ordinary language to what's testifiable and created an algorithmic logic by which we can construct human behavior and describe all human behavior in this language. Does that make sense?
I like it.
So so P-law is a specification for a via negativa programming language of testimony, law, government, and economics.
Okay.
This is going way better than I thought, but I can't figure out if it's just because you know so much already. So what is it like learning? Well, that's the problem. Of course, you can learn programming without knowing law or economics, or behavioral economics, or cognitive science.
Okay.
Unfortunately, to know P-law requires the opposite. It requires a basic understanding of the first principles. So what I've tried to put in here is those first principles, but it's a little overwhelming, and that's why people say that when you enter and start looking at it, it's overwhelmingly complicated. But once you understand it's this dumb, simple rule of continuous recursive ambiguation applied to all these things, producing these first principles from which you have to use this structured language to produce with this limited vocabulary.
Right.
Now you've said, okay, now I get it. This is really simple. Because there aren't any limits. Huh?
It does require a lot of background.
The thing is, we can teach it. We can teach programming. We can teach this.
Yes.
Right? I mean, it's not any harder because it is literally a programming language. It's just a via negativa programming language, thou shalt not, versus what we do to the computer is thou shalt.
Yes.
And that's because inversion, justification to falsification because of human scale. We can cooperate at small numbers, right? We can agree. This is the problem of female bias in the left, right? Is that they believe we can cooperate if we all agree. Well, that's not what we want. We want the opposite. We want as many people pursuing as many opportunities that are not bad as possible.
I like that.
So this is just the summary. It produces a constructive logic of decidability from first principles of the physical, formal, evolutionary, and behavioral laws of the universe. And we use a simple process of exhaustive disambiguation using adversarial prosecution, discovering those first principles, and then using strict operational vocabulary and grammar to express sentences, claims, and arguments, and then testing those sentences, claims, and arguments against each dimension perceivable by humans and the first principles of every stable state in the hierarchy of stable states that we call the sciences. You know, that's what it is,
sentence,
right?
Man, that is one wicked sentence, right?
That is a wicked fucking sentence. I understand, but that's it. I mean, it's like, you know what, if physicists can show you today, they can show you the entire laws of the universe in about 3 lines. It's a formula, right? And you can break it up into these pieces. Now, at a high level, I understand that. There's actually math in there I can't do because I just haven't done it. Right. But I understand what it's doing. But it's that reductive. Well, you know, it helps to have that formula because you know that it's expressible that simply. It helps to know that the formula is expressible this simply, but you have to know enough of it to understand it's expressible that simply.
That's right. Like I say, it's a good sentence right there. Very clear.
So there's a thing. This is where I find this is where I'm proud of myself. I'm only proud of myself for a couple things, and this is one of them, is that E.O. Wilson, who was a sociobiologist, wrote fantastic literature on the relationship between biology and society. And in his one of his claims is that we needed to complete the synthesis which is to find a universal general rules across all of them. Well, I'm saying that this is the general rule across all of them. Is that there's no different. We use language because language is simply richer than vocabulary of fundamental forces.
Right.
Right. But that's all. But it's all the same thing all the way across it. So when we're talking about this, whatever. So my view is that this is the completion of the unification of the logics and sciences.
Beautiful.
Okay, that's the explanation of what we're going to do.
I like that. I think that's a good ending point. Does that work for you?
It works for me. Okay.
That was very useful. I appreciate your taking that minute with me. I really do, because it's no small thing to ask.
Love you, man. Thank you for your help. I really appreciate all you do.
It's a pleasure, and I'll look forward to talking to you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.